The night I planned to propose, my brother crashed my truck into her father's hardware store. A letter came saying she never wanted to see me again. And 3 decades later, a stranger knocked on my door and called me Dad. Hey folks, it's Hank from Mind-Blowing Stories. Pull up a chair. Before we get rolling, do me a kindness. I looked at the numbers last night, and 96 of you watching aren't subscribed. I'll be honest, that stings this old heart a little. If you like stories that twist and turn and tell the truth about how life really feels, hit that subscribe button, give this a like, and drop a comment. I read them all. Okay, here's the one I've been circling for years. The one about the girl I loved and the life we almost had, and the hard miracle that came back around. This goes back to the spring of 1978 in a little Ohio town called Willow Creek, a place with 2 stoplights, 1 Dairy Queen, and a water tower that always leaked a thin, rusty tear down its left side. I was 21, strong from throwing tires all day at the Goodyear plant, and stupid in that way you can only be before you've learned what your mistakes will cost. My whole world was a Saturday night and a girl named Claire Dawson. Claire had hair the color of new pennies and a laugh that got the waitresses refilling our coffee without us even asking. She worked the counter at her dad's hardware store, and she knew the difference between a flathead and a Phillips faster than I could say sorry for breaking another thing, trying to fix the first thing. She had this way of listening to you like there was no background noise in her head, just your voice. It made me feel like a man you could rely on. I had a plan. I'd been putting $20 bills in the hollow of a loose floorboard in my apartment, saving for a ring I saw downtown. Simple white gold with a small diamond that flashed when the jeweler tilted it under the light. My idea was to take her to Marblehead Lighthouse by the lake, where the rocks make that clacking sound like old bones when the waves hit them just right. I was going to say something smooth, something like, Claire, I want to belong to you and for you to belong to me, and I want to keep your car running and your coffee warm for the rest of our natural lives. I practiced that speech in my truck with the radio off. Now, about my brother. Every story like this seems to have one. Mine is Johnny, a year younger, the sort of handsome that makes people forgive the same mistakes twice. He'd shoot pool until his last dollar was gone, then talk a drink out of someone who had a better night. I loved him because he was my brother, and because when we were little, during the worst winter our side of town had ever seen, he gave me his only pair of dry socks. You don't forget kindness like that even when you're counting the fresh ones that came after. The trouble started on a Thursday. I say started, but you can always trace it back further if you're honest. That afternoon, I was in the hardware store pretending I knew anything about pipe fittings, while Claire steered me gently toward the right aisle. Her dad, Walter, had a face like he'd carved it himself with a dull chisel. He didn't like me. He didn't like my family. He said we were the kind of folks who would borrow a hammer and never bring it back. He wasn't wrong about the Millers. My father drank, my mother stretched nickels until Thomas Jefferson cried, and our last good Christmas had been in 6th grade. That night, Johnny came by my place looking like a storm cloud in a leather jacket. He asked to borrow my truck. Just for a few hours, Hank, I swear. I told him no. He did that thing where he looked at my boots instead of my eyes and said he'd walk then. I should have let him walk. Instead, I tossed him the keys and said to bring it back before 11 because I needed to pick up Claire at her place the next morning to take her to the lake. He slapped my shoulder in that grateful way of his and walked out whistling. I went to bed staring at the ceiling, practicing my little speech. At 3:17 in the morning, a siren coughed itself awake. My phone back when we had them on the wall, all coiled cord and heavy receiver rang like it owed somebody money. It was Dale from the volunteer fire department. Hank, he said, you better get down to Maine. I pulled on jeans and my work boots and sped down there in my neighbor's rust bucket because, as you might guess, my truck was already at the scene. Nose first through the glass front of Dawson Hardware. The front had collapsed like a mouth missing teeth. Smoke was clawing at the roof. Walter was standing outside in pajamas, barefoot on broken glass, yelling for someone to get the ledger, and where was that good-for-nothing boy who'd done this? Two firefighters wrestled him back. Dale met me with that sorry in advance look. "Johnny," he said, "is fine. Little cut on the forehead. Said a cat ran across the road, swerved, couldn't stop." I felt the ground tilt under me. He pointed toward the back of the ambulance. There was my brother, shirt slashed open where the EMT had checked his chest, a bandage on his brow, pale as a ghost trying not to shake. I wanted to kill him and hug him at the same time. He saw me and broke like a bad dam. "Hank, I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't." I looked past him at the smashed counters, the shingles curling in heat, and I saw Walter staring at us like something in him had gone permanently dark. The cops came. Small town. Everybody someone's cousin. Sheriff Klein, a big man with a high voice that always surprised you, walked around the scene sucking on a wintergreen mint. He said the words he was supposed to say: reckless driving, property damage, insurance. It would have been a mess but fixable, except for one small problem that didn't seem small at all when they pulled Johnny's jacket apart and a handful of rolled-up 20s fell out. When they took him to the back to ask questions, I followed. Sheriff Klein looked at me and then at Johnny and said, "This yours, son?" Johnny stuttered. He said the craziest thing, like a man trying on lies to see which one fit. He said, "I was going to put it back. I wasn't going to keep it. It was right there by the register, and the glass was already broken, and oh man, I don't know." His voice ran out of gas. I understood the rest without him saying it. He hadn't just crashed into the store. He'd climbed through the wreckage and taken cash. Maybe he thought it wasn't stealing if everything was already broken. I put a hand on his shoulder. I told the sheriff it was my fault. I said I'd let him borrow the truck. I said I'd take responsibility. Those were words I should have measured more carefully. Responsibility is a word like gravity. You think you understand it until you realize you're falling and you can't do anything about it. By noon, the insurance man had come. The official phrase was reckless endangerment and theft under $50. Johnny insisted it was less than 50 because small town or not, those numbers matter, and they said the judge would likely give community service and a fine to cover deductibles, maybe probation, so long as nobody got hurt. The something that turned all that into a different story happened around 2, when Walter Dawson went back into what was left of his store to retrieve that ledger he'd been screaming about, tripped on a board and cut his palm open on an exposed nail. A little injury, the sort of thing men tell stories about while opening jars to prove they still can. Except the nail was rusty and the cut was deep, and he didn't get a tetanus shot right away because men like him don't believe in doctors until something is truly wrong. He got an infection that wouldn't quit. Claire came by my apartment that night with clean clothes in a paper bag and tears that made her eyes even greener. She said, "Daddy's not right, Hank. He's mad at the world, but mostly at you." I tried to tell her the truth, which is harder when it makes someone you love see you through a window you didn't ask to be put behind. I told her Johnny had made a mistake, and I'd take the blame if it kept my brother from going to jail. She grabbed my hands and said, "I know you'd do that. It's what I love and what scares me about you. You carry everyone else." I wanted to say, "Let me carry you." I wanted to say, "Come away with me this weekend and let all this nonsense be another thing we outgrew." We still plan to go to the lighthouse on Saturday. I told myself a proposal is a kind of bridge. Maybe it could get us all to the other side. Saturday morning came with a sky like polished steel. I drove the rental truck I'd gotten because my own was sitting sad in a lot behind the tow yard. And when I arrived at Claire's house with the picnic basket and the ring sitting snug in my back pocket, her mother answered. Margaret Dawson had a soft voice and a hard mouth. She looked past me like my face was an inconvenience between her eyes and the horizon. Claire isn't home, she said. She's with her father at the clinic. I asked which clinic. She closed the door. I drove to 3 different medical offices before I found them. Walter sat in a chair watching his hand like it belonged to someone else who had disappointed him. Claire looked so tired I wanted to lift it right off her and carry it for a while. She gave me a small smile and said, "Not today, Hank." I nodded. What else could I do? The ring burned a hole into my hip. I went home with the picnic basket still full and the speech still unsaid. Over the next weeks, I worked and visited her when her father wasn't around and wondered how a single decision rolled around so long inside your life. I learned from Johnny that he wasn't out of the woods with the sheriff. The insurance company kept asking questions. They said the register was missing more money than he confessed to. Johnny swore he hadn't taken more. I wanted to believe him. I did. But I kept thinking about those rolled-up bills and the way he'd been shaking. Then something happened that changed the color of everything. Claire called me over to the little park by the river, where the benches were always peeling, because no one could decide if they were supposed to be white or blue. She sat down and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. "Hank," she said, "you're going to be a father." The world got big and quiet. I watched a duck fight its reflection in the water and felt my heart beat in my throat. I felt the edges of the picnic speech I never gave rearrange themselves into something stronger, something that could hold up a roof. I said we should get married quick, even if it's just us and a preacher and a borrowed cake with our names scratched on top. She smiled at my foolish heart. She said she wanted that too. We decided we'd meet at the Greyhound station the next Friday night, take the late bus to Toledo, where her Aunt Sharon lived, lay low until things calmed down, get married with a cheap ring, and figure the rest out later. You already know this next part because you know how stories like this go when boys think they can outrun the small-town gossip mill and stubborn fathers. Friday came. I packed a duffel with 3 shirts, good socks, and the ring box. I slipped out the back door of my place to avoid my landlord, who was always looking at me like I had bad news in my pocket just for him. I walked to the bus station through a smear of rain. I sat right under the clock. The hands crawled. Every door opening felt like it might be her. The smell of diesel and old coffee settled into my clothes. 10 o'clock turned into 11. At midnight, a custodian with a broom told me he'd be closing one side of the building. At 1, the last bus I could have taken rattled into the dark without us on it. Near 2 in the morning, a kid with a denim jacket and too many zippers brought me a letter. He said, "A lady gave this to me outside, told me to give it to the man in the green plaid shirt." He pointed at me. I opened the letter right there under that clock. "Hank," it said, "I am sorry. I cannot do this. It has to be over. Do not try to find me. I'm not who you think I am, and you're not who I need. Please don't come by the house or the store. I won't read any letters you send." It was signed with her beautiful, careful C that used to make me feel like my name had been blessed. I sat there like a man who'd suddenly forgotten his home address. The ink had bled in 2 places, like the writer had cried and then decided it wasn't worth crying about anymore. There's a pain that feels like someone's pressing your ribs together from the outside with both hands. If you felt it, you know what I'm talking about. You don't wail. You make a sound like an unhappy refrigerator. You nod a lot like someone gave you directions, and you're sure you'll get there someday. I walked to the river and folded the ring right back into its box, and then the box into the bottom of my sock drawer. I went to work the next morning and didn't tell a soul. On Sunday, I called my mother and told her I was thinking about applying for pipeline work up north. She said, "If cold keeps you alive, go for it. I signed up for a job in Alaska within 2 weeks. I didn't tell anyone where I was going except my mother, who promised to feed my houseplants or kill them trying. The night before I left, Johnny came by with a six-pack and eyes like he'd seen the devil. He said he was sorry about Claire. I asked how he knew. He said everybody knew. Small town. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You'll find someone better." I wanted to break his hand right off for saying something so stupid. Instead, I told him to get out. He did. I stayed in Alaska almost a year. I learned how quiet snow can be and how loud men can get when they're missing anything soft enough to be broken-hearted over. I worked hard and sent money home. I wrote a letter to Claire every month and tore each one up. Sometimes doing nothing still feels like doing something if it hurts enough. When the thaw came and the company cut half the crew, I went home. Walter's hardware store was a liquor store now, the kind with cheap whiskey and a rack of newspapers that only ever got used to start charcoal grills. I asked around. People said Claire had moved to Toledo to help her aunt. Some said she'd married a teacher. Some said she'd gone to Chicago with a nurse's aid program. A few said she'd had a bad run and it was better not to ask. Her mother passed me one day on Main Street and looked through me like the glass of the grocery store window. I tried not to hate her. Hate is heavy and sticks to the soles of your shoes. You want to know the horrible truth I learned later, but I didn't know it then. That letter wasn't from Claire. I had a life to get around to, so I did. I started with little things, like buying plates that matched. I got a job with the Postal Service, walking routes with a sack slung over my shoulder, learning the names of the dogs and kids and lonely widowers who waited at their windows for my knock. All that walking saved me. The rhythm of my feet, the bundle of envelopes would get lighter, and I'd look down a street and know exactly how many steps there were to the corner. There's comfort in predictability when your insides feel like an overturned toolbox. I met Linda in 1983 at a church picnic I didn't want to attend. She was 5'3" and good at Scrabble, and the first person I'd met since Claire, whose silence didn't make me nervous. We got married at the courthouse with a potluck afterward, where the potato salad could have used more salt, but no one said anything. She taught 4th grade. She believed that small kindnesses kept a person stitched together. She taught me how to keep houseplants alive. Now listen. When I say this is a love story from my past, you might think I forgot Linda. I didn't. I loved her with the kind of love you tend like a garden. We had a solid 29 years. We tried for kids, and after a while we stopped trying so hard and lived with the quiet. We watched old movies on Friday nights and argued playfully about whether Cary Grant was a better leading man than James Stewart. She got a cancer diagnosis in October and was gone by March, faster than anyone deserved. There are months I can't account for around that time. People bring you casseroles and you forget what warm tastes like. Here's where the story takes the turn. After Linda passed, my grandson, my sister's grandson, who adopted me as his, told me I needed a hobby that didn't involve staring at the same patch of carpet. He set up this channel for me, Mind-Blowing Stories. He said the name would make teenagers click. I laughed and said I wasn't sure my mind could blow anything anymore. He showed me how to talk into the camera like it was an old friend. He said, "Tell them the story about the time you met Johnny Cash at a truck stop." I did. People watched. They wrote kind comments. It kept me breathing. 2 summers ago, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a crossword puzzle, wearing the same pair of flannel pajama pants I'd worn since '96, when someone knocked at my door. Not a light tap, a firm, I know who I'm here for kind of knock. I opened it to a woman in her 30s with hair the color of new pennies and eyes greener than I remembered, standing there like she had practiced a speech and forgot how it started. She had a folder held tight against her chest. She said my name in a careful voice. "Are you Henry Miller?" "Depends who's asking," I said, "because grief makes you smart alecky." "My name is Sarah," she said. "I think I'm your daughter." I swear the earth tilted. Not a big tilt, just enough to make the coffee in my cup quiver. I said, "Come inside." She did. She sat at my table like she had been sitting there her entire life. She put the folder down and opened it. On top was a DNA test printout from one of those kits you swab your cheek for and drop in a mailbox. It said with many decimals that we were parent and child. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes your body doesn't know what to do with the truth. I looked at her face, and it turned into 1,000 flickers of Claire at 18, and also not Claire. She had a way of pinching her lips when she thought before speaking. Claire used to do that when she counted change at the register under the clack of the fake storm, sounds they piped over the speakers to sell emergencies. She said she grew up with good people in Toledo. Her adoptive parents had told her from the start she was adopted. She did the test after her own son was born because she wanted to know her medical history. She hadn't been looking for me, not exactly. But the internet is a bloodhound when it wants to be. It matched her to a second cousin who matched her to my mother's sister, who wrote Christmas letters to everyone she'd ever met. And then there she was on my porch with my history spread out like a quilt. I asked the question that had been waiting for me for 40 years. "Do you know Claire?" She nodded and my heart forgot its plan. She said, "She's my mom." Her voice lifted when she said mom. It made me feel like I'd learned a word I used to know. She said, "She thought you left her. She thought you knew about me and wanted no part of it." She said when she was 7 months along, her mother took her to Aunt Sharon's in Toledo. And after the baby was born, she was told the baby had been placed with a good family and that was that. She said she had wanted to look for me for years, but she was afraid of finding out I didn't want to be found. I ran a hand over my jaw. I said, "I didn't leave her." She left me a letter saying it was over. Sarah looked at me like I was the one with green eyes. She said, "She never wrote you a letter. She said she waited at the bus station for 3 hours and you never came, and then a boy brought her a letter. We sat there with 2 different versions of the same night." I could hear my grandmother's clock thunk the seconds like it was hammering nails. I asked if she had the letter. She did. She reached into the folder and pulled out a page that looked like mine. Only this one told her I never wanted to see her again. The handwriting. I knew it at once and couldn't place it. Not Claire's careful hand, not mine. We spread the pages on the table and looked at them like detectives in a cheap television show. The letters were written on similar paper that had a watermark shaped like a little crest. It was the stationery from Dawson Hardware. There was a grease stain on the corner of mine like someone had held it while eating a burger. The handwriting had a slant to it that bothered some old part of my brain. I got up and dug through a box in my bedroom where I kept old things I wasn't ready to throw out. There were cards and a ticket stub and, at the bottom, a folded piece of paper with Johnny's grocery list from 1977. Milk, camels, beans, WD-40. I put the grocery list next to the letters. It was the same hand. Not exactly, because years stretch your script into something sloppier. But there it was. The J that sat too high. The S that looked like a backward Z. My brother had written both letters. My brother had broken 2 hearts with one mercy he thought was wise. I sat down. Sarah put a hand on my arm and said, "There's more." She went on to tell me that her adoptive dad was Sheriff Klein. There's life for you. Doing the long, slow turn. He helped with placements at the county office because back then, things were done in a way that made sense to whoever had the biggest key ring. He knew my mother's family, knew Margaret Dawson, knew half the town. He didn't know all the details, or maybe he did, and the world looked cleaner if he didn't. When Sarah told him she was looking for me, he stalled. He asked that she give him a week. She did because he's her dad, and even grown children are still children when their parents use that voice. He went into his attic and brought down a cigar box with a rubber band around it. Inside was the confession letter I'm about to tell you about. Johnny died in 1997 in a motel off the highway of an overdose after another try at getting clean that came close but didn't stick. My mother had buried him with a photograph of us as kids in the pocket of his suit. She told me that, crying into my coat. She didn't mention any letter. I figure she never saw it. Before Johnny went, he wrote something down and mailed it to Sheriff Klein because he didn't trust himself to give it to me without weaseling out at the last minute. The sheriff put the letter in a box because what else do you do with a little truth when no one asked you to deliver it? I opened the sheriff's letter with hands that didn't feel like mine. The paper had yellowed like old teeth. I read my brother's words, and I swear I heard his voice in my kitchen. Loose and honest the way men are when there's nothing left to lose. "Hank, I'm sorry," he wrote. "I'm sorry for the store. I'm sorry for the money. I was in deep with some guys, deeper than I ever told you. I thought if I could grab a little cash, it would keep them off me long enough to work a double and make it right. I hit the gas and the truck jumped the curb, and it was like falling face first into a plate glass wedding cake. After, I saw the register and I saw the bills, and I did the worst thing. I did it because I thought I could handle the consequences. I couldn't. You always had a good face and a good voice, and people believed you when you said you were sorry. They didn't believe me, and they were right not to. I wrote you that letter from Claire because her mother asked me to. She came to me with an envelope already half written and said if I delivered it, she'd make sure the sheriff went easy. She said it was the only way to keep Claire from making a mistake that would ruin her life. She told Claire I'd give her a letter from you. I told myself I was saving everyone. I'm the reason you both stood at that station alone. I put the letter down and walked to the sink and stood there like I was going to be sick. Then I washed my face with cold water until the man in the window looked like someone I might trust again someday. Sarah watched me carefully. She said, "Mom never got over you. She remarried when I was 8 to a kind man who liked baseball and built birdhouses, but there was always this old note in the back of her eyes. She told me once she had a lighthouse story she couldn't tell. I told her what that meant, and we cried in that dumb kitchen of mine until our noses ran, and I got us both bad paper towels that stuck to our cheeks. I asked her where Claire was now. I expected Florida. People like us are always imagining everyone else made it somewhere warmer. She said not far. She lives in Bayview near the lake. She manages a thrift store that smells like cedar and mothballs and the secrets people leave in old suit pockets. And then she said the sentence that made me younger and older at the same time. She wants to see you. She's wanted to for years. We picked a Saturday. That whole week my legs remembered how to be 21. I almost wore my old work boots before remembering that wincing old men stumbling over gravel isn't romantic. I drove to Bayview with the radio off, the ring in my pocket like a joke only time would understand. Polson's Diner hasn't changed since God threw his first pancake. There are cracked red booths and a waitress named Dot who takes your order like it's her life's mission to get you exactly what you need. I saw her through the window. Claire. The years had made a tapestry where there used to be a bright flag. She was still her, hair shorter, the laugh lines deeper, a little ridge on her knuckle where she'd once cut herself on a jar of peaches that wouldn't open. Her eyes were clear green. She stood when I came in and we both forgot how hugging worked for a second. We settled on hands first, then everything else. We ordered coffee we didn't drink. We said each other's names like we had to get our mouths used to them again. We laid our 2 letters on the table and stared at them. Dot walked by and said, "You kids okay?" I said we were and realized I meant it. Claire said she'd believed her mother because that's what you do when your world is splitting and you need one person not to lie. Margaret had told her I'd changed my mind, that I'd said things I didn't mean, that I'd send money when I could for the baby, which seemed to prove I knew about it. And then there was a letter that said I never wanted to see her again. "It is very easy," she said, "to believe you are unlovable when someone tries to make you believe it. She told me about Sarah's birth, how the nurses were kind and the bed was too stiff, and Aunt Sharon cried in the hallway while whistling hymns through her teeth. How a lady from the county office came and said words like safe and placement and consent. How Margaret signed on the dotted line with her teacher's precise hand while Claire's hand shook too hard to write. She told me she had tried to find me 3 times, once in 1981 when she heard I was home, once in 95 when she stood across the street from the post office and watched me put mail in a box for a woman who kissed you on the cheek afterward, and once after her stepfather died and goodbyes felt less scary. Each time, she said, something stopped her. Shame, fear, a green-eyed little girl who needed supper. I told her about Linda, about how love had come back around to collect me, but not in the way I expected. Claire listened like the world could be moved by listening alone. She touched my arm when I said March. We went to the lighthouse after breakfast. Some places are stubborn in their beauty. The rocks said their names to each other like a song. The lake was restless. We stood by the fence and looked out at the horizon that refuses to admit it ever ends. Claire took my hand. She said, "This is where you were going to ask me to marry you." I nodded. She asked if I still had the ring. My heart tripped over a stone. I said I did. She smiled at me, sad and beautiful as anything I've ever seen. She said, "I kept the bead you put on my bracelet the night we watched the 4th of July from the back of your truck. I kept that little red heart like it was proof that once there was a world where everything was simple." I pulled the ring out of my pocket and pressed it into her palm. I said, "This belonged to the woman I loved at 18 and to the woman I love now who shares her eyes. Do with it what you think is wise." She closed her fingers and put the ring back into my hand. She said, "Hank, I have lived a good life. I raised a daughter who raises a son. I got to laugh on summer nights and learn how to fix the belt on a vacuum cleaner by reading the manual upside down. I am not who I was. You are not who you were. I think what we can do is honor them and let them rest. But I am not giving this back to you because I don't want it. I am giving it back because I want you to be the one who decides where it goes next." Love like that should keep moving. We stayed right there until the sun made the water into a handful of broken mirrors. We talked about the town and who died and who got fat. We talked about Sheriff Klein, who retired but still walks the mall for exercise, with a group of men who wear ball caps with ships on them. We talked about Margaret Dawson, who passed 5 years prior. Claire said she had forgiven her mother finally the day she saw her own stubbornness reflected in Sarah's son, throwing a tantrum over a red crayon. Forgiveness comes in sideways. A week later, Sarah invited me to her house for Sunday dinner. Her husband, Josh, grilled too many burgers. The kid, Ben, showed me his frog collection, which was thankfully only plastic. We sat under a maple and passed corn on the cob down the table and laughed the way people laugh when relief has been installed in their bones like a new hip. After pie, Sarah brought out a small box. She said, "I was going to wait until Christmas, but I don't believe in waiting anymore." Inside was a thin chain with a little charm shaped like a lighthouse. She said, "Mom says you should have the real one, but we can't pick it up and carry it around, so this will have to do." Then she reached out and held my hand and said, "I know you weren't there, but I'd like you to be there now. If you can, if you want." I said, "I want." We spent that fall getting to know the ordinary, the text about a leaky faucet, the call about a stomach bug. Claire and I went to a matinee and sat in the back like teenagers, except she wore better shoes. I helped Sheriff Klein pull down a stuck window at the VFW, and we nodded at each other like men who had held on to a thing too long and were relieved to set it down. If this was a movie, maybe Claire and I would have married and moved into a little house by the lake where the kitchen smelled like cinnamon toast. Real life is trickier. She had built a life, and so had I, and the pieces didn't fit exactly. We loved each other in that careful way you love when you know how much breaking you can survive. We decided to keep the place we had found, which was less than everything and more than nothing. It was a choice that felt adult, and I'm proud of us for making it. There's one more piece I want to tell you because it explains the last knot that came loose. Sarah called one night in November and said, "You should come by." She had that good news voice people try to hide and can't. When I arrived, Sheriff Klein was there with his cigar box. He said he had something else for me. At the bottom, under old badges and a fishing license, was a photo. It was a security camera still printed on cheap paper. It showed the inside of Dawson Hardware the night of the crash. You could see my truck's bumper across the bottom. You could see the register crooked on the edge of the counter, and you could see a figure reaching into it. The figure was small, smaller than Johnny, smaller than me. It was Margaret, hair in curlers. She had pulled her coat tight and was lifting bills out of the drawer with calm fingers, like she was straightening a tablecloth. Sheriff Klein said he had found the photo when the insurance company had asked for additional documentation. He had kept it then because he'd already arranged to call the case good, and he didn't know what to do with a truth that complicated. I sat with that for a long minute. It didn't erase what Johnny did. It didn't turn him into a saint, but it made the story less simple. Margaret had been saving the store in the weird way you save things when you're drowning. She had made a deal with the sheriff. She had traded her daughter's future for her husband's pride and some cash that probably went straight to a past due bill. I stood and walked to the sink and ran my hands under water again, because that's what I do when I need to feel something I can name. After that, I stopped hating anyone in this story. I was tired of carrying that. I took the ring, the white gold, with the small diamond that had flashed at me under the jeweler's light when I was a kid, and I brought it to Sarah. I told her its weight, and I told her to do what her mother said to do. Keep it moving. She wore it on a chain for a while. One spring afternoon, she called me from an orchard with the sound of bees like static behind her and said, "Josh asked me under the apple tree," and I said yes. I didn't ask what ring he gave her, because that's not the point. Things belong where they are loved. So here I am. If you came to this channel for explosions and car chases, I'm sorry and I'm not. What blows my mind after all these years isn't that people lie or get scared or say the wrong thing and live with it. It's how many times we get a shot at telling the truth anyway, how many doors there are to knock on, how many hands there are to hold, even if they're late. I think about the bus station sometimes. The clock's still hanging there, probably slow by 10 minutes, the sound of feet and nobody going anywhere. I picture two kids sitting on two benches, each holding a letter written by someone who said she knew best. I want to go back and take those letters and set them on fire right there on the tile floor and march those kids to the bus with their bags and their bad plan. But then I remember Sarah and Ben in his plastic frogs, Sheriff Klein walking the mall in his ship cap, Linda teaching fourth graders about adjectives, telling them sometimes a word needs a good match to feel complete. Life is not a straight line. Maybe we got where we were going anyway, just later and with detours. If you've got a person out there you loved once and you got tricked into staying away, I won't tell you what to do. But if your hands are steady and your heart can stand it, you might try knocking on that old door. The worst that can happen is that you find out you were right to leave it closed. The best thing is that you find your life still waiting on the other side of a thin sheet of paper. You're still here, which means this story meant something to you. If it did, I'm asking. Subscribe to Mind-Blowing Stories. It helps more than you know, and right now 96 of you watching aren't subscribed, which I'll admit makes this old man a little sad. Tap that button. Hit like. Tell me in the comments if you've ever found your way back to someone or something you thought was lost. I'll be in there, coffee in hand, reading what you write, and if you want more, I've got plenty. The world keeps handing me tales. I just try to tell them true.